Okay, Chapter 7, Let's Go Global. In class, we started off with uh, some ideas to give you a sense of just how pervasive and important these global strategies are. You're not going to need to worry about those specific examples I gave for the exam. Uh, it was all just an attempt to convince you that this stuff was really important from knowing where you are from a global perspective. And so I said, these are the big questions that you have to deal with when you do international operations. Where are you going to sell? What product mix are you going to sell with? How are you going to handle your manufacturing? How are you going to organize? Although I'll tell you right now, there are no questions on the exam about how you organize. What is your entry strategy? There are many. And what risks are incumbent or inherent in international operations? Sold where? These are the reasons that companies expand. This would be just a good slide to be familiar with for the exam, kind of get your mind right. Um, I'll tell you right up front, there are no test questions on global versus international competitors, and the idea is that not all companies compete in all markets. What product mix? This is really key. We talked about the fact how countries differ in their tastes and sometimes in their requirements, and because of that, a huge question a company has to offer or has to ask as it begins to launch international operations is, what product are we going to offer? Are we going to tailor our product to match local tastes, or are we going to try to offer a relatively standardized product around the world? And obviously those are two poles, and it's not pure one way or the other. It's a matter of how much local adaptation. So we talked about how in clothing and in a lot of foods, there's a lot of tailoring to local taste. Whereas if we look at a computer, a smartphone, a lot of computer software, or a Boeing 787, you can see that it's a standardized product offered worldwide. This is a good chart to pay attention to. I want you to read these blocks so that you understand each of these strategies, and I think you'll find that will help you out with at least two of the test questions. Also remember that I tell you, you ought to insert mentally this block in between these two, because this is the hybrid of the two where it's a little bit like a best cost strategy, a little bit of differentiation, a little bit of cost leadership. Um, so try to keep that straight, but do spend time reading each of these blocks so that you understand what is meant by these strategies. As far as the think local, act local, the advantage is you're likely to grow your market share because you are tending to the distinct tastes and requirements, which, if you're in enough markets, will allow you to grow global market share. However, the problem is you're likely to create problems in your production chain as you have all of these offerings. So you increase the complexity of the value chain operations to deliver those products. You may dilute a worldwide brand, and it causes you to be good at lots of different things. The flip side is true of the global strategy. So it allows you to focus and get really good at some things, but perhaps your product won't have as much appeal because it's not tailored to the individual markets. And then we get to this hybrid, think global, act local, the middle ground approach, just like it says there. Why they didn't build this slide like that, I don't know. So you give the managers a little bit of leeway, but not a lot. And you try to maximize the efficiencies of your product offerings and your manufacturing and the like. Okay, next topic, manufactured where. This is how you want to consider using your location to boost your advantage. I talked about in class how Dell produced computers in Ireland because it eliminated the tariffs, but yet Ireland was a relatively low-wage, low-tax country within the European Union. These are the questions you want to ask yourself about being concentrated. And this has to do with, are there really good economies of scale? Are there lower costs in a location? Obviously, right now, this is what favors the China and its neighbors in terms of low labor costs. Do you need to consolidate the activities because there's a lot of internal learning that goes on? Or is there just a location has a particular advantage, which is kind of akin to that one. The flip of that is also true when you disperse them. You need to be close to the buyers, perhaps for transportation reasons, perhaps because they have a strong preference for local products and they will perceive your product as local if it's sold there. We talked about dispersing activities, and yet in some ways that can disperse your risk, or it can also increase your risk because it makes you vulnerable in a whole bunch of ways. Under what organization? No test questions on that. Using what entry strategy? Test questions on that. So these are the various entry strategies, and I'll talk about each of them in a little bit of detail. Exporting, in theory, is what you're doing right now in Globus. You have a single plant producing a global product that you're just shipping worldwide to the various retailers. What do you see? Well, you hopefully have lower manufacturing costs. You're paying shipping costs, you're exposed to exchange rates, and if countries wanted to levy tariffs, you would be vulnerable there too. Licensing, you don't tend to hear of these deals just because they don't make the press or you don't recognize them, but they're certainly there. This is when a company has something valuable, typically a piece of intellectual property, and they're able to license it to other companies to use their intellectual property to make something. And what this gives the company the opportunity to do is frankly know virtually nothing about those internal markets, and let that other firm take all those risks. You simply are selling them the use of your intellectual property. And this can be very profitable, particularly when you have partners who you can trust, who are not going to rip you off, and they're actually going to pay. The downside is you may lose control of the intellectual property. Franchising, this is when it's a lot like licensing, although in these cases, you're also typically using your brand name. Questions are how much local tailoring are you going to offer? And we saw lots of the food chains, the quick serve food chains, and hotels that are global using franchising strategies. Alliances and joint ventures, this is really a repeat of the alliance section, and these are ways that you benefit from it on the slide. It just adds in the additional wrinkle that you're probably going to have cultural issues to deal with as well. So again, these are all the same risks. You just have the cultural additive factor. Then highest up is the acquisition and or internal startups. So acquisition says that you purchase something. Internal startup says you go into the country and you just build it. And talked about how Walmart has gone and done some acquisitions. Internal startups, Intel has done a lot of that stuff. So this is the greatest investment risk, but also affords you the greatest control. Creating an internal startup is a good idea under these conditions. And again, this is something I would like you to be very familiar with. And then finally, risks. We talked about political risk and economic risk. In Globus, you have no political risk. You certainly do have economic risk. So in terms of the political risk, weak governments, civil unrest and revolt. So companies are living that today in the Ukraine. Anti-business legislation and regulations. This would be in some part, for example, Venezuela, which has passed just a bunch of laws that actually have taken over companies. That's made it very difficult for foreign companies to operate. We talked about systematic corruption. And as much as we want to see this as a cost of doing business, as a US-based company, you also have the legal issues that even if a bribery is common in a country, if you are a US-based company, you cannot bribe other people. And so Walmart's run into problems with that in Mexico, as even though bribery is relatively standard for low-level officials to get stuff done, it's a violation of US law. And then you get down into China. A lot of people feel like this is where China is, to include some anti-foreigner legislation, that it's a different playing field in the Chinese domestic market if you are a Chinese company versus anybody else. Economically, the biggest thing that you have to worry about is exchange rate risk. And we see that in Globus. And the main thing I want you to walk away from a standpoint of being a manufacturer, a home country manufacturer, regardless of what country is home for you, as a manufacturer who's going to export their products, a weak home currency is a good thing because it tends to make your products cheaper than everybody else's. Conversely, if today we had a strong dollar, that would be bad for US-based manufacturers who are trying to sell their products worldwide. And that's really the main thing I want you to remember about the exchange rate. And that's the stuff you need to worry about. Profit sanctuary, not so much. Join me in just a minute for Chapter 8.